Hello and welcome to this next section on Is Technology Good? So today we're going to be talking about disruption, most brought about by technology, and from an entrepreneurship perspective, is technological entrepreneurship good? So these are things we're going to be covering. Very briefly, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Rajived Basaramwait from Aarhus University, and I work as an entrepreneurship educator at our natural science faculty. And I also have a huge interest in open innovation and gamification, and have my own entrepreneurial venture, Biosymphonics Edu Games, that develops education solutions for the education sector as well as the corporate sector. So, with that, let's dive in straight into the topic. So, what is disruption? Now, this is, of course, the act of something being changed by something else, right? So, it is disrupting an activity or disrupting something that you're normally doing. And disruption is becoming a new normal. And the reason disruption is becoming a new normal is because there's more and more technology that's coming and replacing existing technology as well. So we don't have to look farther, a lot more years back even, but just in the last few years, for example, we have been seeing so many news headlines that are really trying to highlight, the different type of industry areas, technology spaces, and physical spaces around us that are being disrupted. We've also had a pandemic that has disrupted a normal way of life, and from this disruption, there are going to come out new innovations and new ways of living, even for example, right? So you can see both the pros and cons of disruption in this way, having lived this kind of disruptive timeline currently. So if we go back a little just to understand the definition of disruption, this was of course coined by Clayton Christensen in 1995 from a business perspective, and he adapted this definition in 2015 when he called it disruptive innovation, where he looked at why or how innovative companies came up with ways to disrupt existing companies' practices and technologies, right? And the existing company, known as the incumbent, of course, would have a certain trajectory, whereas you would also have the entrant who would, of course, try to follow the same trajectory but be lower than that of the incumbent, and would, of course, try and catch up with the incumbent, and in some cases replace the incumbent. What is interesting is that or at least the main take-home message here is that disruptive innovations do not generally catch on with mainstream customers until their quality catches up to their standards, right? So this is something that is worth considering. An example I can throw in here could be Google Glass, for example. This early sort of entrant in terms of wearable technology, and it did not become mainstream. Was also quite expensive, so of course least profitable for the company as well. And at the same time, it didn't have adoption, right? A lot of people soon even rejected the technology, and that's some of the things that can happen with a disruptive technology. So this is again how technology normally is adopted. However, in terms of disruption, we need to think how it exactly happens. And I think there are three dimensions that is, summarized very well in this figure by Disruption Hub. And they say these three elements are: one, there has to be an emerging technology. Now, an emerging technology can be, I mean, take your pick of any of these new technologies that we have around us, robotics, virtual reality, 3D printing, Internet of Things, all of these things are there. But the technology itself cannot disrupt something, right? The technology needs a driver, needs something to take it forward. And we call this a business model enabler. That's the second component. And the business model enabler tries to sort of ensure that that technology can sort of get in place. So for example, the cloud has disrupted the way we store data or access data. And if you think about it, if it wasn't for the cloud, maybe the type of online the way the entire world moved online would also not have happened the same way if it wasn't due to the cloud, right? So you need to consider how an emerging technology can really or how it needs to ride on a certain business model enabler. And then on top of that enabler, you also need an exponential adoption curve, right? And adoption curves basically means users adopting it, and the exponential is how fast they're adopting it as well, and in what scale. And in general, there has been sort of a standard S-shaped curve in adoption where you have a slow growth and then it slowly picks up over time. But what we're seeing in today's time is that this growth is much more exponential, is much more steeper, and we have much higher rates of growth as well. And why do we think this is happening? So we'll come back to that in a second. But if you think of some examples here, let's look at Uber, Airbnb, and Alibaba. I think three of the very interesting examples here because while they each are unique in their own space, they actually share one commonality, and that commonality is that they all three of them do not own the thing that they actually run, right? So Uber doesn't own any taxis, Airbnb does not own any any apartments or inventory. Alibaba also, as the world's most valuable retailer, does not own any inventory, right? Amazon, for example, has to own inventory, but Alibaba doesn't, but just connects people and still one of the world's fastest growing retailer, and especially has transformed, or let's use the word disrupted, the way the business to business market transacts, for example. So this is again just showing you how these companies came about and, of course, tried to make a big impact around the world and change the way things were being done. Now, that doesn't mean that they themselves can't be disrupted because even disruptors get disrupted by other things. You can be disrupted by new technology or competing technology. You can be disrupted by regulations that normally catch up on new technology. Regulations always have a habit of catching up and of course, it depends on how prepared you are to meet that let's say reaction. So in many ways, I like to summarize this by saying innovators act, markets react, and sometimes the reactions are positive and help your technology getting adopted, and sometimes those reactions are negative and your technology can get rejected, as for example, Google Glass. So this is again, how disruption sort of happens. It's a very dynamic space. So I did say that disruption is happening much faster, but I'm also saying that it's becoming a normal. And the reason why it's becoming normal is if you really compare the world of just a decade back versus today, the difference is we are much more connected. It's a completely interconnected world and globalized world that we haven't seen this level of connectivity at this fast in ages. And this prediction, which was made by IDC and Intel in 2012, where they predicted that by 2020 we would have 4 billion connected people, 25 plus billion embedded and intelligent systems, 50 trillion gigabytes of data, 25 plus million apps. And while they predicted this, these numbers have more than been surpassed, and partially that has also been just by the exponential speed at which things have been happening, but also even more by the pandemic. A completely different, a completely biological disaster that has happened, and this pandemic, for example, has triggered technology in a completely different way and technology adoption. A lot more people have moved or been pushed to adopting technology that they otherwise would have adopted at a much slower rate, right? And which means that already by January 2020, the data looked very clear that more than half the planet's population is connected to the internet in one way or another, and that itself is quite telling. And this level of connectivity also means that you can expect disruption in the short term and the long term as well. And this may be driven both by within data, for data, by data itself, because of the data that is being generated, and also sometimes by the lack of data for those that don't have access. Accessibility and equity concerns might also cause different types of disruptions that we can't even predict the nature of which at this point. So at this point, I have a thought exercise for you. I would like you to quickly grab a piece of pen and paper or just on your computer on a notepad, just write down what top three disruption things or disruption trends you see coming in the days ahead. Okay. And once you have been able to list these three things, I would like you to then, of course, rate them. but you can do the rating later after you've watched the video, but at least just list it so that it's fresh in your mind. And then you should rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is less impact and 5 is more impact. And after you've rated for yourself, try and also rate what the impact can be for the society around you. And I think it would be a good exercise to then bring this kind of suggestion to your teams of your peers or your classmates or your group mates, and share your findings, or even share them on an online forum where we can discuss and see, for example, what are your own predictions. So, and this I think can be a very interesting exercise. So please do try this and see where this takes you. Okay, so that brings us then to the question, is technology good? And to answer this, I'm going to take you down memory lane and back to history a little bit, a small history lesson here. So, and the question I have for you here is, where do billiard balls come from? So I give you 5 seconds to quickly think, just from the top of your head, do not Google, where do billiard balls come from? Okay. And if I slightly rephrase the question again, where did billiard balls come from in the early 1900s? Again, these were in the late 1800s and 1900s. These kind of saloons popped up all over the places, and they were quite popular. This image here is a historical image from a saloon, a billiard saloon in Broadway in downtown New York, and again shows us how sort of it was seen as a sport of the gentleman as well. So the answer, of course, lies in this short video, and we're just going to play it while you're still maybe guessing. Just pause it for a sec. I'm sorry, the video is in Dutch, but you probably don't need to understand Dutch, but just see what the source is.
De meeste biljartspelers zullen wel niet precies weten hoe ze vervaardigd worden. Bij dit edelspel wordt ook edel materiaal gebruikt, ivoor.
Okay, so you saw very clearly that the answer is, of course, the ivory tusk, and the ivory tusk that comes from elephants, and most of them, of course, are in Africa. And you could see that these businessmen, most probably, or together with hunters, probably sourcing these materials, if we can call it that, at that point. And what is, I think, an even more telling figure is, of course, this figure that I found, that one tusk is equivalent to about 3 to 4, would be required to make only about 3 to 4 billiard balls. So you can imagine how many tusks were used and how many elephants sacrificed for this human pleasure. Now, this is something that is sort of indicative of a common problem, a problem of we utilizing, let's say, natural materials in a certain way to create something for human use, but when we do that, we of course have a consequence, and in this case, the negative consequence is of these animals being killed, and of course harming both the ecosystem and the biodiversity even at some point, to be able to generate these, let's say, human goods. Interestingly, of course, as innovative human beings, we came up with enterprising ways to solve these kind of problems and see if we could source this from different material, right? And here, for example, we had this discovery of the this material called cellulose nitrate, which is also known as celluloid, and essentially the same thing that you use in to make movies and transform the entire movie industry, or created it even. You could also see that this was John Wesley Hyatt's sort of the founder of the first plastic resin, right? And then by 1920 already, the material again was discovered in 1868, and by 1920 we had celluloid billiard ball manufacture almost completely replacing ivory billiard ball manufacture. And I think that in itself was of course a much relief to the elephants in this case, and of course a positive impact for the planet as well. Now, what is interesting is that this material discovery also kickstarted the plastics revolution, and then we had, like telephones and other things that were being created, cellophane by 1912 already, and being also having another positive impact in the sense that it allowed food to be preserved and stored for longer, and therefore useful for human for human needs in a certain way, right? Now, what is interesting is this same miracle material, though, then today kills the same animals that they were created to save. And I think that is very telling, right? And again, this, of course, you need to consider if how has that happened, right? Is this an unintended consequence, or is this something we just knew was about to happen? What could we have done to change our path, for example, here? Right? So I like to put this thought in your minds. Is it the material itself? Is it the throwaway culture or something else that created these newer problems? And could we have foreseen this? If we could not foresee this, what could we do? Could we react to it in a certain way? Are we reacting enough, for example, today to some of the challenges that were kickstarted by our peers or by our past? So this is interesting to consider, right? And the idea here is again, it's about asking the right questions. I like Charlie Brooker, who's the creator of Black Mirror, the TV series, this quote where he says, if technology is a drug, and it does feel like a drug, right? Because it makes us feel good. And then what precisely are the side effects? And what is interesting is that normally when we go and create a medicine, we, for example, of course, want to document the side effects. We will not give a medicine without trying to, of course, having documented its side effects. The question is, why don't we do the same for technology? The Black Mirror TV series sort of tries to do that for new technology and social media and all of these things, and trying to see what could happen, right? And imagining it. Of course, it's fiction, but it's still quite telling sometimes. And EU startups, for example, which is an entrepreneurial division of the EU, actually even highlighted in this article that based on Black Mirror, the TV series, they actually listed 10 technologies that that they would never want to see in real life, that we should probably not go and create those technologies because they probably have some very negative consequences. So I think it's very important that for us as technologists and scientists to ask these questions and ask them when we are doing the development of this technology and not much later, right? So to really think about these consequences. So if we get back to, is technology good? Well, the answer is it really depends on how we use it. Entrepreneurship is really a way to drive change. It can be used as a way to find solutions to problems. It often is, but it is also important to try and think ahead of the consequences and the impact of these solutions that you're going to come up with, that you put forward, right? Just because a solution is cool, solve the problem, doesn't necessarily mean it is the solution we want, right? Because you have to also look at the other consequences that that solution might do, right? So you need to think about sustainable solutions powered by entrepreneurial and thoughtful action as the way to go forward, right? I mean, I'll just end with another example. The fact that we came up with a lot of harming pesticides, for example, that were harming the planet, killing our bees and all these kind of things, um, have now kickstarted a revolution in trying to say, okay, can we make more environmentally friendly pesticides or control our plant growth in another way. In fact, we are even moving to sort of co-growth of plants where sometimes we are saying that maybe removing all types of weeds is not completely necessary, and some weeds are actually also protectionist. They can offer some kind of protection to certain plants as well. And I think this kind of thought is again quite useful because people need to think about the consequences of whatever they are developing and not be very short term in their outlook as well. So I hope that as you go forward with your solutions, you will keep this in mind. So all the best with your brainstorming and creativity and coming up with good, sustainable, thoughtful solutions. Thank you. And until next time.